Today, I'm going to explain to you why I think Muhammad was a real person. To explain where I'm coming from, I'm not Muslim. I am a Christian. And the reason I'm making this video is because there's a lot of people, both on the sort of Christian internet world and also in secular academia, who are forwarding a theory that Muhammad never existed. Now, to get here, people are employing something called the higher critical method, which has been employed against Christians for a few hundred years and has been pioneered in 1800s Germany. And I personally don't believe it's actually that useful a way of trying to find out what truth actually is. Basically, what it's doing is taking a sort of automatic skeptical default position and saying, unless you can demonstrate to me hard archaeological evidence, I will not believe something like this from history. So I'm going to get into some of that evidence, and I'm going to give you another reason why I think Muhammad was a real historical figure. But first, to make the counter argument. So the basics of that argument, and if you want to learn more about this position, you can look at people like J. Smith and Al-Fadi, who's a friend of mine. I met him in the airport one time. He's a good guy. I just disagree with him on this. The theory being proposed is that the early Arab conquests were not done by Muslims who believed in the Muslim religion, but were performed by Unitarian, that is non-Trinitarian Christians who were at war with the Trinitarian Christians. And then as these Arab Christians moved into these old empires, they wanted to distinguish themselves from the Christian authorities that were already there and distinguish their culture and have their own prophet so they could have more authority to be the rulers of this land. And so to support this theory, what people are arguing is that Muhammad allegedly died in 632. And the earliest biography of Muhammad is by a guy called Ibn Ishaq, who lived from 704 to 767. So he probably wrote about 100 years after Muhammad died, which is a pretty big gap. But to add insult to injury here, we don't have any original copies of Ibn Ishaq. Everything we have from Ibn Ishaq is transmitted to us from two places. One of them is a guy called Ibn Hisham, who's writing in 799. So that is 160 years after Muhammad died. And then Al-Tabari quotes Ibn Ishaq as well, but he's writing in 900, he's in like 915, well into the Abbasid era as well. And then Sahih al-Bukhari comes 210 years after Muhammad's death, and then Al-Tabari and the classic Islamic histories are coming in the 900s. So the argument is, between Muhammad's alleged death and the time of the Abbasids, there are no written accounts, there are no rock carvings, and there's no evidence of Islam on early Arab coins. So for example, if you look at a coin with Muawiyah on it, it actually contains crosses on the coins. And what's more than that, sources that do mention Muhammad from non-Muslims are often contradictory. So one source, for example, says that Muhammad led the Arabs at the Battle of Yarmouk. But according to Islamic history, Muhammad was long dead by this point, and it was Khalid ibn Walid leading the Arabs. One piece of evidence that has been used is a rock inscription by Muawiyah in Jerusalem about the rebuilding of a public bath. And it makes, again, no mention to Muhammad or to Islam in any meaningful sense. However, what we do see on this tablet at the bottom, it says this construction was completed in the year 726 of the colony, according to the Arabs, the 42nd year. So, this tablet is using the Hijri calendar. So if this is not a reference to Islam and Muhammad and the move from Mecca to Medina, what is this in reference to? Why would these people suddenly start counting time differently? There's another source from this time called John Barpenki, who's a Persian Christian monk who's writing a letter complaining about the inadequacy of the church of his time, but he makes mention of the Muslim conquests. God raised a barbarian kingdom against us, people who would not hear supplications, who knew no compromise, no peace, and disdained flattery and meanness. Its delight was in shedding blood without reason, and its pleasure laying hands on everything. Its passion was raiding and stealing, and its food hatred and anger. It was never appeased by offerings made to it. When it had prospered and done the will of him who sent it, it had taken possession of all the kingdoms of the earth, had subjected brutally all the peoples, and brought their sons and daughters into a bitter slavery. So there he's talking about the Arab conquest in a very unfavorable light. But then it says, so the Lord, to punish the sons of Hagar for the ravages they had made, gave them 2 leaders from the beginning of their kingdom, and divided them into 2 sections. This was so that we might understand the word that was spoken by our Saviour. But they were united until they had subjected the whole earth, but when they returned to tranquility and rested from war, they fought one another. Those in the west said, superiority is due to us, and the king must be chosen from among us. Those of the east contradicted them and claimed that it was to them that this was due. As a result of this contention, they came to blows. Then, a man among them named Muawiyah took the reins of government of the 2 empires, Persian and Roman. Justice flourished under his reign, and a great peace was established in the countries that were under his government, and allowed everyone to live as they wished. So what you see here is a basic outline of the geography and timeline of the Sunni-Shia conflict, right? It doesn't mention Ali here specifically, but it gets the correct geography when referring to this. And then it also paints Muawiyah in a favorable light and paints him as a tolerant leader, which would explain the Christian imagery on the coins and rock inscription, because he's trying to build peace with the Christians under his reign. It then goes on to say, firstly, they were so attached to the tradition of Muhammad, who was their leader, that they inflicted the death penalty on anyone who seemed not to obey his commands. So this is clearly identifying somebody named Muhammad as the lawgiver of the Arab civilization of this time. This doesn't seem to be given just as a sort of random title of the leader. This actually seems to be referring to the progenitor of their way of life. To clarify things further, he says, from every man they required only the tribute and left him free to hold any belief, and there were even some Christians among them. Some belonged to the heretics and others to us. So he's actually differentiating heretical Christians who he disagrees with, who are serving the Arabs, from the Arabs themselves, right? So it doesn't make sense that these are just heretical Christians, because he's specifically mentioning heretical Christians serving them. So I think, from the evidence here, the general broad strokes of the Islamic timeline are confirmed by this. The essence of the story, makes sense. So if Muhammad died in 632, there's also the category of people that could have met Muhammad and would remember meeting Muhammad. So let's say you have to be 5 years old to remember Muhammad. That would mean you have to be born in 628 AD, which would put them, and if those people happen to live to 100, that would be 728 AD. So there is a slim chance that Ibn Ishaq could have met somebody who met Muhammad, although it gets pretty unlikely. But then you also have the children of the people who met Muhammad, and Ibn Ishaq certainly would have had the opportunity to meet some of them. Islamic history didn't just stop with Muhammad himself. There's lots of other contentions. So going back to the Sunni-Shia conflict, that really kicks off with something called the First Fitna, which results in the death of Ali in 661. And Ali and Muawiyah were fighting with large forces in this, which means that you have veterans of this war. And this was 40 years before Ibn Ishaq was born, which means there's a pretty high chance that Ibn Ishaq could have interacted with veterans of the First Fitna. And then those First Fitna veterans would have also had children. And they would be contemporaries to both Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham. So you have this sort of cultural sense of history there that would be preserved through the veterans and their children. On top of that, we also have the grandchildren of the people who fought in the First Fitna as well. So to give you a contemporary illustration, it is now 106 years since the First World War ended, which is about the same amount of time it is between Ibn Ishaq writing and Muhammad living. And so for me, I know World War I happened. on a number of levels, right? I can, read about it in books, but even if all the books were forged, my great-grandfather went to Jerusalem in the First World War fighting for the British. And my great-grandfather told my grandfather and my father of stories of how he fought in the First World War. Now, would it be possible to make up details about the First World War that did not happen? Absolutely, and we can actually demonstrate that that happens. For example, there's a story of something called the Angel of Mons, where the British soldiers claimed that an angel stopped the German soldiers from advancing so they had time to escape. Now, we know how this story originated and isn't real history, and you can certainly make stories like that and exaggerate things over a 100-year period. But what you couldn't do is make up someone like Woodrow Wilson. You couldn't make up Vladimir Lenin. You couldn't, make up the sort of Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, or the Treaty of Versailles, or things like that, which had impact on world history later. Then once you get to the distance between Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham and the First Fitna, we're looking more like the distance between us and the Second World War. And both of my grandfathers fought in the Second World War, and everybody has at least nebulous sense of who Hitler was and what the Second World War was about, even 80 years later. And especially in a society where military is such an integral part of culture, like in early Islamic society, that people don't forget the reason that their parents and their grandparents fight wars. It doesn't make sense to me that the Abbasids, seeking to justify their own power and control and influence over society, would simply invent someone like Muhammad from their imagination. Firstly, because if Muhammad was not the sort of founder of this movement, then there were real leaders of this movement that have been deleted from history. And that doesn't make any sense to me. If you're somebody in the sort of Abbasid conspiracy room coming up with a story, why not just take an existing historical figure that people already love, already revere, already respect, and embellishing their legacy and putting words in their mouth that support your government? That would make much more sense and is much more plausible when we look at human behavior, when we look at how civilizations develop and what we actually observe from history. So all these reasons are some of the reasons why I believe that Muhammad was a real historical figure. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below.